Elizabeth first ruled for 45 years and turned a shaky, divided England into a confident, creative power, a time people now call the Golden Age. Stick around and first we'll explain, slowly and clearly, how one queen's choices shaped politics, culture, and even the way we speak today. Think of Elizabeth as part monarch, part brand manager, part CEO. She used her image like a logo, her navy like a delivery service, and her speeches like marketing copy to keep a fractious country together. First we'll show how simple decisions, choosing a middle way in religion, backing explorers, and supporting the theater, had big, real-world effects, like more jobs, more trade, and more stories people still love. For example, backing sailors meant new trade routes, a bit like a small startup turning into an international company. Supporting playwrights helped an entire entertainment industry bloom, like funding a hit TV show. No fancy jargon, just plain talk, everyday examples, and a touch of humor, yes, with roughs and far fewer emails. By the end you'll understand why Elizabeth's era feels golden, and why it still matters to us now. The childhood that shaped a queen. Born into the highest of circles as the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's early years were marked by sudden and brutal changes in fortune. Her mother's fall from favor and execution led to Elizabeth being declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession, and that single reversal reshaped how she would relate to power, trust, and safety for the rest of her life. Small household shifts became seismic events, one day surrounded by courtiers and tutors, the next sent away from the center of court life. Children today who experience a parent separation or sudden change in social status know something of that shock. The scale was different, but the feeling was familiar, bewilderment, followed by a cautious learning of how to adapt. Her schooling was unusually rich for a girl of the time, and it mattered. Tutors such as William Grindal and later Roger Ascham taught her to read and think in Latin and other languages, to handle classical texts, and to write with care. She also learned music, dancing, writing and drawing. These weren't mere pastimes but tools for winning friends and showing competence. To put it plainly, she had private lessons like a modern student with top tutors, and those lessons gave her real advantages. Learning languages, for instance, wasn't just academic, it let her read foreign letters herself and judge tone and intent, a practical skill even now when misreading a message can cause a feud or a diplomatic faux pas. A steady figure in those uncertain years was her governess, Catherine, Cat, Ashley, who provided emotional steadiness and practical care. Close friendships and loyal servants anchored Elizabeth when official status shifted beneath her feet. Later influences also came from female mentors who encouraged her curiosity and steadiness rather than simply arranging marriages. That kind of encouragement is like having a teacher who sees your potential and nudges you toward it, rather than someone who only tells you to sit still. Those relationships taught her that loyalty can be built quietly, and that the people who stay with you through small hardships are often the ones you can depend on when storms arrive. The psychological results of all this were as important as the learning itself. Early exposure to court intrigue taught her to be cautious with trust, to mask disappointment when necessary, and to cultivate patience and self-reliance. She learned to turn setbacks into lessons and to present a composed face even when the room behind her was in chaos. In modern terms, she became emotionally literate, politically savvy, and resilient. A child who learns to manage household chaos by taking on responsibilities grows up with steady nerves. Elizabeth's schooling and UPS downs gave her exactly that. A little humor helps to see it plainly. She mastered the art of saying, "How interesting," in a way that could mean anything from delight to thinly veiled horror, an invaluable skill in any office or family meeting. Tudor science and the curious mind. Scientists and curious courtiers in Tudor England increasingly favored testing nature through observation and experiment instead of relying only on old books. This was a real change in how people thought. Rather than quoting Aristotle as the final word, they watched, measured, and wrote down what happened. One leading idea was simple: gather facts from the world around you and let those facts guide your conclusions, a method that sounds like common sense today but was revolutionary then. Practically, that meant more time in workshops, shipyards, and apothecaries, and less time taking ancient texts as gospel. Hands-on experiments were everywhere, from the royal court to small towns. An instrument maker might grind lenses for a simple spyglass, while an apothecary mixed herbs and recorded which remedies helped wounds or stomach aches. A famous natural philosopher showed that a compass needle lines up with something in the earth. Think of the planet as a giant magnet, and he tested this idea by comparing magnets and rubbed amber, pointing out differences people could see for themselves. A life example: if you rub a balloon on your sweater and it sticks to the wall, you're witnessing a version of the same curious spirit that led people to name and study electric effects. They called it something new and began experiments to understand it. Some tests were elegant, others messy, and a few smelled awful, but the point was the same: try it, note it, then try again. Practical navigation improved as a result of these investigations. Mathematicians and advisors promoted better charts and taught sailors to use instruments more carefully, so voyages could be planned with less guesswork. Observers also turned their attention skyward, making careful drawings of the moon and sunspots and comparing notes with colleagues. Back on land, naturalists and collectors assembled cabinets of plants, shells, and minerals to study differences and similarities, an early form of sorting and classifying the living world. Think of it like a curious person today taking photos, cataloging them, and then sharing the useful ones with friends. The habit of recording and exchanging observations helped ideas travel fast for the time. You can copy that curious mindset easily with simple, safe experiments. Make a tiny compass by magnetizing a sewing needle, floating it on a cork in a bowl of water, and watching which way it points. That demonstrates magnetism clearly and without fuss. Try drying a slice of bread in two places to see how moisture and airflow affect mold, and you'll be practicing the same observational skills used by apothecaries testing preservatives. A bit of humor helps. When they couldn't Google a recipe for success, they tested it in the kitchen or workshop instead. The lasting lesson is practical: watch closely, question what you read, try small experiments, and write down results, and that simple, curious habit is arguably the most lasting gift from those early scientific explorers. The political laboratory of a new monarchy. Elizabeth treated governance as an experiment, assembling a flexible center of power that could be adjusted like a recipe in a kitchen. She relied on a small, trusted group of advisors gathered around the Privy Council to run day-to-day business, rather than handing everything off to a handful of nobles. William Cecil acted as the steady administrator who kept records, managed finances, and smoothed relations with Parliament, while Francis Walsingham built an intelligence system that tracked threats and plots. Together they made the machinery of state both efficient and cautious. This approach let the crown react quickly when problems popped up, without having to call a big, slow meeting of the realm every time someone disagreed. It's a bit like a manager who holds a tight group of lieutenants and lets them sort out issues before announcing decisions to the whole company. Power was meted out through favors and roles, not just by blunt orders. Land grants, court positions, and honors were tools used to secure loyalty. Giving someone a comfortable sinecure or an important-sounding title often bought more obedience than a hard command. She also kept marriage negotiations on the table as diplomatic tools while rarely committing, using suitors to extract concessions or create alliances without tying the kingdom to a spouse. In modern terms, think of it as negotiating a deal while keeping multiple bidders interested, useful leverage and a warning shot at rivals. This system required constant attention, since favors could breed jealousies, and a misplaced grant might create a rival instead of a friend. Intelligence and secrecy formed another experimental wing of her governance. Networks of informers, ciphers, and intercepts were used to uncover conspiracies and foreign plots before they became crises. The practice of planting spies and reading intercepted letters may sound like a spy novel, but it functioned as basic risk management. Better to know who's stirring trouble than to be surprised. The result was a steadier sense of control at court. Conspiracies were exposed, conspirators removed, and the realm stayed more stable than it might otherwise have been. It's comparable to modern security practices, background checks, audits, and careful vetting, only with more codified secrecy and fewer cybersecurity protocols. She also learned to balance the need for popular legitimacy with fiscal caution and diplomatic prudence. Rather than plunging into expensive continental wars or making permanent, costly commitments, she preferred calibrated interventions and the occasional support for private ventures at sea. Encouraging merchants and private ships to attack enemy trade lines or explore new routes both hurt rivals and boosted the economy, without the immediate cost of a standing continental army. Cultural patronage played a role too, supporting poets, playwrights, and artisans built a shared identity and softened public opinion. Think of it as a combination of targeted investments, public relations, and crowd-pleasing events, practical politics dressed up with spectacle, and often quite effective. A little theatrical flair and a well-timed favor could keep a kingdom intact. Elizabeth's image, propaganda as performance. Elizabeth carefully built a public face that did more than flatter, it sent messages. Portraits, coins, and badges carried visual clues, pearls signaled purity, the phoenix promised rebirth, and the rose linked her to the dynasty. Artists in her circle produced tiny painted keepsakes and larger official pictures that people could point to and say, "That is our queen." Nicholas Hilliard, a well-known miniaturist at court, painted small images that courtiers exchanged like modern-day signed photos. Think of those miniatures as early celebrity headshots, only with stiffer collars and better jewelry. She treated public life like a stage. Royal progresses, when she traveled around the kingdom, were carefully timed performances, complete with pageants and scripted speeches. In those moments she could be the generous monarch, the virtuous mother, or the untouchable goddess, depending on what the scene demanded. Access was controlled, only a few saw her up close. It's rather like a company CEO doing a meet and greet where only selected employees get a selfie. The point was the same, appearances were rehearsed, and spontaneity was rare. Printed poems, theatrical entertainments at court, and official proclamations multiplied the image. Playwrights, poets, and court artists worked in a kind of team to repeat themes about her wisdom and divine favor. Portrait painters followed conventions, a pale face, high forehead, elaborate costume, so everyone recognized the message at a glance. Costume and makeup were not merely fashion choices but props in a long-running show. In everyday life this is like a lawyer who always wears the same suit to court to project reliability, consistency breeds recognition. There are practical takeaways that still matter. Consistent visual language builds trust, small, repeatable symbols can convey complicated ideas quickly, controlling the setting of an appearance changes how people receive a message. But there's a warning, too. Overmanaged images can feel staged and lose credibility if they stray too far from reality. She knew how to mix spectacle with substance. And that combination is why her image became a brand people remembered. Religious settlement, pragmatism over dogma. Her government put in place clear rules. The monarch would be the supreme governor of the national church, and everyone was expected to attend services that followed an approved prayer book. That meant there was a single, public pattern of worship across the realm, using the Book of Common Prayer as the standard. At the same time, the settlement kept the old system of bishops and many familiar ceremonies, so it did not tear away every habit people had grown used to. This mixture of legal authority and familiar form was meant to steady a country pulled in different directions. Practicality guided the choices more than strict theology. Clergy had to follow certain rules about what they preached and wore, but the settlement avoided forcing ministers into detailed theological debates. Some church decorations and robes stayed, which annoyed purer reformers, while Catholics faced penalties if they openly rejected the monarch's authority. Enforcement often depended on local officials. In many places, people could get by with private beliefs that differed from the public norm, so long as they did not challenge public order. Think of it like a workplace dress code that insists everyone wear the same uniform but leaves room for small personal touches. The goal is visible unity without policing every private preference. Families found ways to adapt. A household might attend the parish service on Sundays but keep certain older practices at home, quietly and discreetly. Neighbors with different loyalties lived side by side, trading a degree of private latitude for public conformity. This trade-off reduced the chance of open conflict and kept everyday life functioning. The settlement's long-term strength came from that balancing act. It did not satisfy the most extreme critics on either side, yet it made worship and civic life predictable. That predictability mattered for markets, courts, and local government. People knew what to expect on Sundays and in civic ceremonies. Sometimes the compromises were awkward. Sometimes they were funny, like insisting on sameness in public while tolerating variety in the kitchen, but the overriding aim was stability, and in that respect, pragmatism won out over doctrinal purity. The royal court as a cultural salon. Elizabeth first gathered around her a lively mix of poets, musicians, courtiers, and diplomats, and they turned the court into a working salon where ideas and art were made, performed, and judged. She herself was a practiced musician who sang and played instruments, spoke several languages, and enjoyed poetry, so patrons and artists found a ready audience. Poets such as Edmund Spenser dedicated major works to her, and composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd were so important to court life that they secured a royal patent to print music, giving them a practical foothold in the business of art. The court was therefore more than ornament, it was a functioning market for talent and taste. Entertainments there were elaborate and varied, mixing music, dance, theater, and spoken word into single events. The master of the revels organized court performances and regulated what could be shown, making the court both gatekeeper and stage manager. Masks and pageants used allegory to flatter the monarch, often featuring elaborate costumes, staged scenery, and symbolic characters. Picture something like a big fancy variety show where every act is also a compliment to the host. Performers could be royal servants, professional troupes, or noble amateurs. The mix created creative cross-pollination and unexpected collaborations. Courtiers acted as patrons and intermediaries, supporting writers and musicians while also using artistic projects to advance their own careers. Sir Philip Sidney moved in those circles as a poet and a courtier, using verse and conversation to build reputation and influence. Patronage worked like modern networking: perform well at court, and a single impressed noble or official could commission you, recommend you, or introduce you to wealthy buyers. A simple life example would be reading a poem at a friend's dinner and suddenly getting asked to write for a magazine. The stakes were higher at court, but the mechanism was the same. Fashion, manners, and public image were also shaped in that salon-like environment. Trends in dress, big ruffs, structured skirts, and ostentatious jewels, spread outward from the court the way celebrity styles spread today. Etiquette and speech were modeled there too. To be seen as tasteful and influential you learned to speak, dress, and entertain in the courtly way. In practical terms, the court's role as cultural salon helped professionalize the arts. It encouraged composers to publish, poets to seek patrons, and performers to refine spectacles that would travel beyond palace walls. That mix of creative energy and political purpose made the royal court a unique place where art served both beauty and ambition, and produced a national sense of style and storytelling that outlived the fashions. Patronage and the rise of English drama. Under Elizabeth's court, money and influence from the Queen and powerful nobles turned occasional entertainments into a steady business, and that shift changed everything. Wealthy households kept their own troupes of players who traveled with them or performed at private gatherings. Think of it like a patron hiring a band for a wedding, but the band also performed at baptisms, feasts, and important visits. The presence of a noble or royal backer didn't just pay the bills, it offered protection, status, and a steady stream of invitations to perform where the right people could see you. Actors who once depended on charity or rough street performances suddenly had employers who cared about reputation, costumes, and presentation. Companies often took the names of their noble sponsors, which signaled both legal cover and prestige. The Lord Chamberlain's men and the Admiral's men are good examples of how a title could become a brand. That was useful in crowded towns where audiences had to choose between rival troops. A noble's name on the bill was like a seal of approval. Some companies split their time between private shows at court or noble houses and public performances in commercial playhouses, so they mixed income from fees and ticket sales, similar to a modern theater company that tours while keeping a home base. The rise of permanent playhouses came out of that mix of patronage and public demand. When a noble or private backer provided funds, troops could afford to build stages and keep costumes and scenery on hand, which made performances more elaborate and reliable. Actors became professionals with regular roles and specialties, and boys were trained to play female parts when women were not allowed on stage. Printed play texts began circulating more widely, too, which helped playwrights gain reputations beyond a single city and brought in a new income stream. In practical terms, this turned drama from a weekend treat into an industry that supported authors, carpenters, seamstresses, musicians, and many others. Playwrights adapted to the tastes and demands of their patrons, tailoring plots, characters, and praise to suit a household or the queen herself. Some scripts contained flattering portrayals of patrons masked as heroic rulers or wise counselors, a form of job application that involved quite a bit of poetry. Court entertainments favored spectacle, music, dance, and costume, so dramatists learned to write scenes that allowed for visual wow moments as well as clever speeches. The result was a vibrant culture of theatrical experimentation, comedies that joked about manners, histories that explored power, and tragedies that showed personal downfall with grand rhetoric. Everyday examples help show how this system worked. A country squire sponsoring a troupe is like a local arts council funding a summer theater festival today. A playwright inserting a flattering character is like a filmmaker dedicating a movie to a patron in the credits. And yes, actors dealing with quick costume changes and dramatic monologues would have appreciated modern dressing rooms. Humor aside, the practical partnership between patrons and players created a professional theater scene, raising production values, stabilizing incomes, and encouraging writers to push for new stories and forms, which is why many of those dramas still speak to us now. Shakespeare and the scientific imagination. Elizabethan life was full of new ways of looking at the world, and Shakespeare picked up on those questions and turned them into drama. Natural philosophy, the old name for what we now call science, was everywhere in conversation, from taverns to the court. That meant people were talking about how to test ideas by looking closely and by trying things out, a habit that shows up again and again in Shakespeare's characters and plots. Think of natural philosophy as the practice of watching how things behave and asking why, like noticing that bread rises faster with warmer water and deciding to try it again. Prospero often stands in for that curious, experimental spirit. He surrounds himself with books and instruments and uses careful observation and stage displays to shape events on his island. He even says that his books are as valuable as a dukedom, a simple line that tells you how much authority study and record-keeping could carry. On stage, magic and method blur. A conjuring and a controlled experiment look surprisingly similar when a character is trying to learn how someone else will react. It's like watching someone set up a chessboard and also a science fair project at the same time. Shakespeare's language borrows heavily from medical ideas that people then took for granted. The five humors, simple bodily fluids once thought to govern mood and health, provide a ready vocabulary for saying someone is angry, sad, or overly cheerful. Characters are called melancholy or sanguine in ways that would make sense to an audience used to that model. You can compare it to how people today say someone is vitamin D deficient when they're gloomy, different terms, same impulse to link body and behavior. Comedic figures like Falstaff are often written in ways that highlight appetite and mood, which audiences would read as signs of imbalance by the standards of the time. Astronomy and the business of getting from place to place also show up as recurring themes. Sailors, storms, and talk of the stars pepper many scenes. Romeo is famously described as a star-crossed lover, a small phrase that carries both poetic weight and the era's fascination with celestial influence. Audiences then were less interested in sharp lines between astrology and astronomy than we are now. Both the heavens above and the instruments used for navigation were part of everyday life. It's like checking the weather and glancing at Google Maps. Both tell you something about a journey, but in different ways. Shakespeare uses both ideas as tools for fate and for practical plot movement. One striking example of experimental thinking in his plays is the way characters test each other. Hamlet stages a play within the play to watch how the king reacts. It is a deliberate, empirical move to gather evidence. That's an early form of hypothesis and observation. Set up a situation, watch the response, draw a conclusion. In ordinary life we do this all the time. Ask a tricky question at dinner to see who takes your side. Shakespeare turns that everyday tactic into a dramatic engine. Overall, his work doesn't lecture about science, but it absorbs the mood of discovery and translates it into human terms. People testing loyalties, diagnosing moods, navigating dangers, these are dramatic versions of curiosity and method. And while his stages never had microscopes or modern labs, they did have close observation, careful record-keeping in the form of stories, and plenty of experiments on human nature. A little less sterile than a lab, and much more entertaining. Exploration and the mapping of the world. English sailors and private adventurers pushed into seas that were still only faint scribbles on continental maps, and their voyages turned blank space into usable charts. Backing for these trips came from the crown and from investors who wanted trade routes, profit, and a bit of national pride. The result was a practical rush to learn coastlines, islands, and currents. Men like Francis Drake and Martin Frobisher didn't just raid or probe, they brought home sketches, place names, and reports that navigators turned into better charts for the next ship. At the same time, explorers such as John Davis helped by improving the tools sailors actually used at sea, making it easier to say where you were with some confidence. Instruments mattered a lot. Sailors measured latitude, that is, how far north or south they were, by observing the sun or certain stars, using simple devices like the cross-staff, the astrolabe, and later the backstaff. These tools are like an old-fashioned protractor and a pair of binoculars combined. Point them at the sun, read an angle, and you get a number that maps to a line across the globe. Longitude, or the east-west position, remained a headache because accurate clocks for ships did not exist yet, so sailors often estimated by speed and direction, what they called dead reckoning, which sometimes led to embarrassing errors. Think of it as trying to find a cafe in a foggy city by counting your steps. It can work, but you might end up at a bakery instead of where you meant to be. Coastal mapping became a hands-on craft. Crews would sail slowly along unfamiliar shores, noting rocks, bays, and safe anchorages while sounding the depth with a lead weight and a marked line. That lead line is the ancestor of modern depth sounders. It's basically a heavy shoe on a rope, dropped overboard until it hit the bottom, and then read to see how deep the water was. Sailors also left notes about tidal currents and wind patterns, which are the kind of local tips today's boaters still trade. Avoid that headland at dusk, the current plays tricks there, and were priceless then. Accurate harbor charts turned dangerous entries into routine stops, and safe harbors made trade and naval operations possible. Map-making itself changed. New ways of drawing the spherical Earth on flat paper allowed navigators to plot straight-line compass courses and follow them more reliably across open seas. Pilots' charts, hand-drawn coastal plans, and compilations from many voyages grew steadily richer as each trip confirmed or corrected earlier information. Privateers and merchants alike benefited. A merchant captain who could read the latest chart was worth his weight in spices. It also meant that mistakes traveled faster. An error in a popular chart could send many ships into trouble, which kept chartmakers on their toes and often led to lively arguments in taverns where mariners compared notes, with plenty of swearing and the occasional tall tale. Practical examples from everyday life help make sense of this. Using a map to find the quickest route to a new supermarket is similar to how captains used coastal sketches to find a safe inlet, and checking water depth with a stick in a puddle is no different in idea from a sounding lead. A little humor was inevitable on long voyages. Sailors poked fun at navigators who insisted they were on course, and cooks complained about sailors who mistook the galley for a storage locker, but those jokes hid serious learning. Over time, the slow, sometimes messy accumulation of observations, measurements, and local knowledge transformed the way English seafarers saw the world, turning vague horizons into reliable routes and allowing ships to venture farther with less guesswork. Naval innovation and the fight for trade. English shipbuilders and sailors began to favor speed and gunnery over the old idea that the biggest hull always won. Hulls were cut lower and sleeker so ships could turn faster and ride the waves with less resistance. guns were placed to fire from the sides, which meant more shot could be brought to bear in a single pass. Think of it like swapping a lumbering delivery van for a nimble sports car that also happens to have a lot of firepower. Practical seamanship improved as well. Sailors learned to handle complex sails and rigging so a ship could tack quickly, and commanders practiced coordinating volleys of cannon fire rather than relying on boarding actions alone. State policy and private initiative worked together in ways that would look familiar to anyone who's seen a modern startup backed by venture capital. The Crown issued letters that let private captains attack enemy merchant shipping without being called plain pirates. Those captains took risks on their own but split profits with investors and the government. Famous sea captains used this system to hit the rich Spanish treasure convoys and to raid ports, bringing wealth back to English ports and investors. The activity looked a lot like a company outsourcing risky business development. The state provided legal cover and intelligence, while private crews did the dangerous work and chased the profits. Ports and yards were the workshops that turned ship designs into reality. Dockyards expanded and became places where skilled shipwrights, ropemakers, carpenters, and cannonsmiths worked together. Supply chains mattered. Timber had to be stored, rope had to be made to exact standards, and spare masts and sails kept ships from being laid up for months after minor damage. Picture a busy repair garage for a fleet of vans. Only those vans were floating, and the repairs were far more complicated. Faster repair and refit cycles meant ships could return to sea more quickly, which in turn kept pressure on rival trade routes and allowed English merchants to take more chances on opening new markets. The changing naval picture affected trade in very practical ways. Merchants who wanted to send cloth, tin, or manufactured goods overseas wanted protection. They invested in convoys or in armed merchantmen that could fight if necessary. At the same time, joint investors pooled resources to finance long, uncertain voyages. These ventures needed the Navy's muscle to survive. This relationship between armed ships and merchant enterprise created a feedback loop. Better ships protected trade, and the profits from trade paid for yet better ships. A modern parallel is insurers and logistics companies sharing the risk so commerce can flow even through dangerous regions. Tactical shifts at sea reinforced the economic fight. Captains learned to use broadsides and maneuver to cripple a merchantman's rigging or to force surrender without destroying the cargo, because a captured ship full of trade goods was worth more than a shore. Fire ships and close-in harassment tactics were used in fleet actions to scatter enemy formations and protect friendly convoys. Navigation and charting improved, too, making long ocean voyages less of a shot in the dark. Better charts and instruments reduced losses and lowered insurance costs for merchants. In short, advances in ships, seamanship, and logistics made it possible for England to contest established trade powers and to grow commerce in new directions. The end result was not a single heroic act but a steady shift: lighter, quicker ships, state-supported private enterprise, smarter port infrastructure, and tactics that prioritized capturing trade rather than simply winning naval glory. These changes had immediate payoffs for merchants and sailors alike, and they created conditions where English commercial ventures could expand with some degree of security. It was an era of practical innovation on the water, clever, costly, and sometimes ruthless, but it worked, and markets noticed. Economics of empire, commerce and credit. English overseas trade expanded rapidly, turning London into a bustling hub for merchants who bought English woolen cloth and sold it for spices, silks, and other luxuries from overseas. Ports filled with ships, and traders developed new ways to gather the money needed for long, uncertain voyages. Joint stock companies emerged so that dozens of investors could pool small amounts of cash to fund one big expedition. Think of it as early crowdfunding, where each backer owned a share of the voyage's profits if the venture succeeded. Merchants relied on credit more than cold hard coins. Bills of exchange and letters from bankers let traders pay each other across borders without carrying sacks of precious metal. A London clothier could send a bill for goods to an Antwerp buyer and get paid through a chain of bankers instead of shipping coins. That worked a lot like modern bank transfers or credit cards, only slower and with more paperwork. Goldsmiths and merchant bankers began keeping deposits and offering loans, becoming the forerunners of the banks people use today. To fund risky overseas trips, investors spread the risk. Small groups would buy a share in a single voyage. Some trips made fortunes, others ended in shipwreck, piracy, or simply bad weather. Investors treated these ventures like high-stakes bets. Privateering, government-sanctioned attacks on enemy ships, also drew private money. A successful capture might bring back a treasure chest worth far more than the original investment. It was essentially venture capital for the sea, and occasionally it made ordinary investors into instant millionaires in terms of goods and goods worth. The crown used commerce and credit as tools, too. Monarchs granted trading monopolies and charters to companies as a way to direct commerce and raise revenue without immediately taxing subjects. Those charters could be very valuable and were another form of economic leverage. They encouraged investment by promising exclusive rights, while the crown received money, influence, or political support in return. At the same time, monarchs borrowed from wealthy merchants and bankers when cash was short, tying royal fortunes to the same credit networks that ran international trade. These financial habits reshaped everyday business practices. Merchants entered into partnerships to share profits and losses, insurers and lenders devised ways to cover the costs of wrecks and seizures, and credit instruments became a normal part of buying and selling. The result was a more connected, if riskier, economy where goods, promises, and paper claims moved faster than actual coins. Modern financial ideas, joint ownership, bank deposits, and trade credit, have roots in those practical solutions to the problem of how to pay for things when trade crossed oceans. A little humor aside, if Elizabethan merchants had had internet banking, they probably still would have complained about a slow ship and scurvy. Daily life and health in Elizabethan England. Daily routines in Elizabethan England depended heavily on social standing, with food, shelter, work, and care varying widely between rich and poor. Households of the wealthy could include dozens of servants who cooked, cleaned, and tended wounds, while most people lived in one- or two-room homes where the hearth served as kitchen, heater, and social hub. Meals for common folk were built around bread, pottage, a thick stew, and whatever vegetables or small game could be found. Wealthier tables featured roasted meats, imported spices, and sugar, both a luxury and a status symbol. Preservation mattered. Smoking, salting, and pickling kept meat and fish edible between hunts and market days, and ale was often drunk because it was safer than directly drinking river or well water. Daily cleanliness looked very different from modern expectations, and habits were shaped by beliefs about health as well as by practical limits. Full-body baths were not common for many people, though some did bathe in tubs when they could. Instead, washing hands and faces, and changing linen shifts, undergarments, were considered wise ways to stay reasonably fresh. People also used herbs and pleasant-smelling items, rosemary, lavender, and little posies, to mask the smells of crowded streets and long-worn clothes. The idea was that good smells might ward off illness. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets or into cesspits, an unpleasant reality that made city living foul and helped spread disease. Medical care mixed learned theory, folk knowledge, and practical skill, with different practitioners doing different jobs. University-trained physicians charged high fees and relied on classical ideas of balance in the body, while barber surgeons handled cuts, wounds, and simple surgery, and apothecaries prepared herbal medicines. Midwives supported most births and passed on hands-on knowledge about delivery, breastfeeding, and infant care. Wealthier mothers sometimes hired wet nurses. Treatments included herbal poultices, mustard plasters to draw out pain, and sometimes bloodletting or purging, methods based on the belief that illness came from imbalances. Some remedies were actually helpful. Willow bark was used for pain relief long before the chemistry behind it was understood. Folk wisdom also mattered a lot. A burned leaf might be applied to soothe a bruise, and sage was chewed for a sore throat. Communicable diseases were a constant worry and shaped public responses to sickness. Plague and other fevers could sweep through towns, and authorities sometimes tried measures like isolating sick households or restricting travel to slow spread. Clean streets and removal of refuse were proposed solutions, but crowded living conditions and poor waste disposal often made control difficult. Everyday practices, venting smoke from a hearth, airing bedding, or keeping food covered, were small but practical steps people used to reduce risk. In markets, sellers and buyers understood that meat left in the sun went bad, so quick cooking and proper storage were important parts of keeping a household healthy. People adapted in creative and communal ways, relying on shared knowledge, neighbors, and tradespeople to survive common hardships. For example, an apprentice might live with his master and eat from the same pot, while the mistress of a household kept herbal jars by the hearth for coughs and bruises. Humor helped too. When all else failed, a strong stew and a louder song at the table were considered medicines for the spirit, if not the body. Communities combined practical habits, local remedies, and social care to get by, and those everyday choices were as crucial to survival as any learned diagnosis. Food, diet, and the chemistry of taste. At royal and noble tables the show of food mattered as much as the taste. Spices, sugar, and elaborate sauces signaled wealth and control over distant trade. Bread and pottage were everyday staples for most people, while the well-off ate large joints of roasted meat, pies stuffed with game, and plenty of sweet and scented dishes. Trencher bread, a stale, thick slice used as a plate, soaked up juices and sauces and then could be eaten or fed to servants and animals, which is both practical and oddly eco-friendly. Fish featured on days when meat was set aside, and preserved foods like salted hams and smoked fish provided reliable protein when fresh supplies ran low. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were used not just to flavor food but to show status. A heavily spiced dish told guests that the host could afford imports. Sugar became a confectioner's playground for the wealthy, used in candied fruits and sweetmeats that finished a meal with an unmistakable flourish. Some sauces aimed to surprise the palate with sweet and sour contrasts. Think of fruity jam served alongside roast rather than the plain gravies we expect today. Simple examples from life: a pinch of cracked pepper on an apple tart lifts it, and a spoonful of honey can smooth out a bitter drink. Taste itself boils down to a few basic sensations on the tongue: sweet from sugars, salty from salts, sour from acids, bitter from certain plants, and savory, or meaty, from concentrated broths and cheeses. Smell does the heavy lifting for what we call flavor. When you close your nose and eat a sandwich it becomes much blander. Browning and roasting create new, appealing compounds. That crust on a roast or the caramel on roasted onions is why people go for the edges. Fat acts like a flavor carrier. A bit of butter or drippings help spices and herbs spread their taste across the mouth and linger. Salt, meanwhile, is the original and still the most reliable flavor enhancer. It tames bitterness and makes sweetness pop. Preservation methods changed how things tasted because they actually changed the chemistry of the food. Salting draws moisture out and leaves a pronounced salty bite. Smoking deposits smoky compounds that cling to flesh and give a long, lingering aroma. Pickling adds tang and brightens otherwise dull textures. These techniques are the forerunners of modern flavoring tricks. Consider how a smoked cheese differs so sharply from a fresh one. Everyday cooking examples: marinating meat in acid like vinegar or lemon softens fibers and adds brightness, and searing develops a rich, complex surface flavor that boiling cannot produce. Diet and taste preferences followed resources and beliefs about the body, so the rich favored a wider range of flavors and rare ingredients while common folk relied on hearty, filling dishes. Practical modern takeaways are surprisingly simple: balance salt, acid, fat, and a touch of sweet to make a dish sing. Try adding a little acid, lemon juice or vinegar, at the end of cooking to lift a stew, or finish roasted vegetables with a knob of butter for a silkier mouthfeel. And remember, your nose is doing most of the job. Give the aroma a moment and you'll find the taste follows. Urban growth and the science of cities. London and other towns swelled as people left the countryside for work, drawn by trade, apprenticeships, and the chance to make money in markets and ports. Merchants who dealt in wool, cloth, and imported goods built warehouses and financed voyages, so cities became hubs of goods and ideas. Rural craftsmen joined established urban guilds, and a growing middle class of merchants and professionals began to shape city life and its priorities. Houses were often timber-framed with jettied upper floors that stuck out over the street, making lanes feel narrower than they already were. Many families lived above the very shops where they worked. A tailor's living room might be above his shop, while the baker's oven heated both bread and bedroom. Streets teemed with hawkers, packhorses, and carts, and market days turned whole neighborhoods into a noisy, colorful bazaar. It could be charming, and sometimes smelly. You'd recognize your neighbor by his wares and, yes, occasionally by the scent of his greatcoat. People of the time began to think practically about how to run a busy town. City officials, guilds, and parish officers handled tasks we now call urban planning, deciding where trades should be located, enforcing rules for weights and measures, and overseeing markets. Simple surveys and maps were used to fix property lines and collect taxes. They weren't fancy, but they made organization possible. Watchmen patrolled at night, and constables kept order by day. It was basic public safety, the ancestor of modern policing. For cleaning and health, authorities tried to keep contaminating trades, like tanners and butchers, away from the most crowded streets, and they regulated where offal and other waste could be dumped, though enforcement was uneven. Everyday life mixed opportunity with risk. The city offered jobs, social mobility, and a lively cultural scene full of plays, music, and public festivities that drew crowds and money into neighborhoods. But overcrowding, shared water sources, and poor sanitation made disease a constant worry, and fires could leap from timber roof to timber roof. To cope, officials experimented with ordinances and local rules, limiting where animals could be kept, licensing vendors, and organizing the watch. It wasn't modern engineering, yet these measures show an early, common-sense approach to managing complex urban life. The result was a patchwork of districts, some prosperous and orderly, others chaotic and cramped, that together formed the living, noisy organism of an early modern city. Technology, workshops, and skilled crafts. In bustling yards and narrow lanes, workshops were where ideas met rough hands and simple machines. A tailor's little room smelled of wool and starch as a doublet was fitted. Next door a cobbler hammered leather into sawls, and down by the river a fuller's mill beat woolen cloth until it was thick and warm. Guilds kept the neighborhood honest. They set standards, taught apprentices, and made sure a silversmith's tiny brooch really was silver by marking it with a hallmark, a little stamp that told buyers they weren't getting fool's gold. Water, wood, muscle and clever gearing did most of the heavy lifting, not electricity or computers. Water wheels turned in streams to power fulling mills that cleaned and thickened cloth, and to work hammers that smashed hot iron into useful shapes. A simple explanation: a water wheel captures moving water and turns it into a spinning motion, which then pushes other parts of a machine. Think of it like turning a bicycle pedal to make a blender work, except the river is doing the pedaling. These kinds of setups multiplied what one person alone could do, so a blacksmith using a water-powered hammer could make more nails or plowshares than one working only by hand. The printing press brought a different kind of technology into town and into daily life. Printers set type by hand, one letter at a time, to make books, playbills, and news sheets that ordinary people could read. This spread ideas faster than ever before. Actors had posters, merchants had price lists, and homeowners could buy pattern books to copy fashionable trims. Meanwhile, shipbuilders shaped great oak timbers into hulls that crossed oceans, and ropewalks, long, narrow buildings for twisting rope, produced the thick lines that kept sails and masts working. Navigation tools and better-made sails meant ships could carry more cloth, spices, or passengers, and workshops supplied the ropes, anchors, and tools they needed. Skilled crafts required long practice and keen eyes. Apprentices lived with masters, learning to measure, cut, and finish to the exacting standards customers expected. A clockmaker needed patience and fine tools to make gears that kept town time, while a goldsmith mixed hard work with artistic flair to set gems into brooches. Everyday examples help. The joiner who fits window frames keeps a household warm and dry, and the wheelwright who shapes a cartwheel keeps the market moving. Little bits of innovation, a better shaped plane here, a stronger joint there, added up to sturdier houses, faster ships, and clothes that lasted longer. And yes, there was no Wi-Fi, but a well-made clock told you when to be at the market, and a reliable pair of shoes kept you from limping home. Printing, information networks, and public opinion. Printed pamphlets, broadsides and small news sheets multiplied across towns and villages, turning ink on paper into a new kind of social currency. Printers and booksellers became central nodes in a network that reached from the court to the market square. The Queen had an official printer, a named, licensed figure who could produce proclamations and authorized books, while dozens of smaller presses cranked out everything from theological tracts to biting satire. This wasn't just about more books, it was about how people learned, argued, and decided what mattered. Cheap single-sheet ballads and broadsides were especially powerful because they were short, punchy, and easy to copy. A literate merchant might buy several and fold them into a parcel, but often the news spread by someone reading them aloud in a tavern or at the marketplace. That meant a single printed page could spark conversation for hours. Think of it like someone posting a catchy song lyric that everyone hums the next day, only louder, and with a lute. Networks of information were not limited to printed sheets. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers carried letters and news from port to port, while parish churches and town criers turned printed proclamations into spoken announcements for those who could not read. Printers also shared type and made copies for each other, which accelerated distribution. When a pamphlet hit a hot issue, copies popped up in several towns in quick succession, and the argument moved from paper into everyday life, over ale, at the tailor's, and in the courtroom. Authorities tried to manage that flow, because words could build support or stir unrest. Guilds of printers registered books and could suppress titles, and the government used licensing rules and official proclamations to shape what was printed. Printers who crossed the line sometimes faced fines, imprisonment, or the destruction of their presses, a powerful deterrent. Yet clever writers and printers found ways around restrictions: anonymous pamphlets, rapid reprints, and ballads that used humor or verse to soften a sharp message. In practice, control was never complete, and public opinion took shape in the messy overlap of written texts, spoken words, and everyday gossip. Pamphlet debates were lively and often personal, with writers answering one another directly in print. One pamphlet would accuse, another would retort, and readers and listeners would pick sides. That back and forth resembled modern opinion columns and comment threads, only with more paper and fewer emojis. Sermons printed for wider circulation added a moral voice to the conversation, helping shape what people accepted as proper behavior. The combined effect was a public sphere where ideas circulated rapidly, sometimes changing minds, sometimes just entertaining people for an afternoon. Everyday examples show how this mattered. A farmer might hear a news sheet read aloud at market and then repeat the news to his neighbors while mending a fence. A sailor arriving from abroad could hand a letter to a printer, who would turn it into a one-page newsummer and sell it the next morning. A ballad seller's tune could make a scandal famous by sunset. These practical, human moments, reading, talking, singing, were the real mechanisms that turned ink into opinion and opinion into pressure. In short, print and the networks that carried it knitted the realm together, giving people shared facts and shared stories to argue about. Fashion, optics, and visual culture. Pale faces, wide skirts, and carefully arranged jewels were not just a matter of taste, they were a language. The Queen's pale makeup and high, shaved hairline created a single, recognizable silhouette that functioned almost like a royal logo. Pearls, embroidered suns, and tiny painted symbols in portraits were chosen to send clear messages about virtue, strength, or divine favor. Courtiers copied these signs because wearing the right fabric or ornament was a public statement about loyalty and status, much like how people today wear team jerseys or brand logos to show who they support. Clothing construction mattered as much as color. Stiff ruffs framed the face and made necks look elegant, while the farthingale, a hooped underskirt, gave gowns that dramatic cone shape, turning women into walking billboards of fashion. Fabrics such as silk, velvet, and richly patterned damask were often heavily embroidered and bead-worked. Each stitch could imply access to global trade and skilled artisans. Sumptuary rules told people what they could wear, so clothing choices became both a fashion decision and a legal one. Think of it as a strict dress code at an exclusive club where breaking the rules could get you noticed for the wrong reasons. Visual technologies shaped how people saw power. High-quality mirrors and small magnifying tools were rare and prized, used by elites to arrange hair, check makeup, or study miniatures. Portrait painters used fine brushes and close observation to reproduce textures, pearls gleaming against satin, or the soft translucence of a painted cheek, so painted likenesses often mattered more than a fleeting in-person glance. Artists like Nicholas Hilliard and Marcus Gerhardt specialized in different scales: tiny, jewel-like miniatures meant for intimate exchange, and large, full-length portraits designed to be displayed and admired. These images circulated as gifts, tokens, and diplomatic presents, functioning as early public relations materials. Everyday parallels make this easier to grasp. A fashionable courtier's embroidered sleeve was the equivalent of a well-crafted social media profile picture, and portraits worked like official press shots, carefully staged and polished. Makeup then could be risky. For example, the popular pale makeup often used lead-based powders, so maintaining that iconic look required serious effort and sometimes discomfort. Yet the payoff was clear: consistent visual cues created an unmistakable presence for the monarch and her circle. In short, fashion, optics, and visual culture were a coordinated campaign of image-making long before cameras, blending craftsmanship, technology, and symbolism into an unmistakable visual language. Witchcraft, medicine, and the limits of rationality. Illnesses were often explained as a tangle of bodily imbalance, bad air, and other people's malice, so treatment could be medical, magical, or a bit of both. Physicians, barber-surgeons, and apothecaries worked from an old idea that health depended on a balance of bodily fluids, commonly called humors, which meant that too much of one thing would need to be taken away or countered with something else. That led to familiar practices: bloodletting to let off excess, purging to clean the system, and herbal remedies to soothe symptoms. At the same time, ordinary folk and even some learned people believed that misfortune, a string of stillborn lambs, a baby who wouldn't stop crying, or a sudden skin disease, could be caused by a neighbor's curse or a witch's spite. Accusations of witchcraft tended to target those on the margins: older women, solitary healers, midwives who knew intimate details of childbirth, and anyone who stepped outside expected social roles. Cunning folk offered a different kind of service: they treated bad luck with charms, advised on herbal cures, and sometimes read causes that a doctor could not see. The line between a helpful healer and a suspected witch could be narrow. For example, a woman who concocted a poultice that cured an infection would be praised one week and blamed the next if that same woman's pig died mysteriously. Small communities looked for explanations, and when explanation failed, suspicion filled the gap. Practical measures against witchcraft often looked like a combination of folk practice and household medicine. People used charms, written prayers, and objects like witch bottles, containers filled with bent pins, hair, and urine, intended to trap or reverse harmful spells. Herbal remedies were handled alongside these practices: rosemary for memory, sage for digestion, and St. John's wort for wounds were common choices. A typical household might try a physician's draft, then call a cunning woman to sprinkle salt and recite a charm, and finally hang a sprig of rue in the doorway, all in the hope something worked. The approach seems chaotic now, but it was pragmatic: try everything that might help, because most remedies had a chance of doing something, whether by chemistry, psychology, or sheer luck. Limits of rationality were plain to see. People lacked knowledge of germs and microscopic causes, so invisible explanations, spirits, curses, or imbalanced humors, made sense. Even well-educated individuals accepted some of these ideas because they were the best frameworks available. Observation and experience mattered too. A midwife who had safely delivered many babies earned trust, while unexplained tragedies bred fear and scapegoating. Social dynamics played a role: accusations could settle grudges or remove a troublesome neighbor, and treatments could serve as community rituals that restored a sense of order. There are clear lessons that carry into modern life. When science hasn't yet given a tidy answer, people mix practical remedies with belief-based ones. The pattern repeats in how some today favor unproven cures alongside medicine. A little humor helps. Bloodletting as a universal fix was like trying to fix every gadget by unplugging it and hoping for the best. More seriously, recognizing those limits teaches empathy, that fear and uncertainty can push people toward ideas that seem strange now. Understanding the past's blend of medicine and magic shows how knowledge grows and why trusted relationships and clear evidence matter in healthcare today. Foreign policy, strategy, intelligence, and risk. Elizabeth's foreign policy rested on a careful mix of blunt instruments and secret tools. She used licensed privateers to hurt rivals at sea, a web of agents to read and feed information, and subtle diplomatic moves to keep powerful enemies off balance. Her court never wanted open war unless it had to, so options were kept open and plausible deniability was prized. The Queen could back an expedition 1 month and denounce it the next, which is a lot like hiring someone to clear out a raccoon from your attic and then pretending you never gave them permission. Embarrassing, but effective. Spying was systematic rather than accidental. A chief spymaster ran an intelligence network that intercepted letters, turned double agents, and cracked codes. Intercepted correspondence sometimes carried the seeds of conspiracies. One famous betrayal involved encrypted letters plotting against the crown, and when those messages were read and traced, the conspirators lost their protection. Think of it as mail screening and password cracking in Tudor clothes. The right piece of intercepted evidence could turn a whisper into a court case. The methods could be harsh, but the goal was simple: to know intentions before they became actions. Strategic risk-taking showed up in open and subtle ways. Privateers like the famous sea captains who circled the globe were given permission to raid enemy ships, which both enriched the crown and weakened rivals without declaring total war. Subsidies and covert aid were funneled to friendly insurgents on the continent to tie up a stronger power's resources, while marriage negotiations and royal gifts served as chips at the diplomatic poker table. At home, leaders had to explain these choices to skeptical advisors and to a public that preferred victories to endless skullduggery. The balance between boldness and prudence mattered every step of the way. In modern terms, it's like a company protecting its market share by funding friendly startups and suing copycats, rather than buying a rival outright. When a major threat loomed, preparation and contingency planning mattered more than bravado. England's naval defense, coastal warnings, and alliances combined with the unpredictable sea to blunt invasions. Logistics and timing often proved decisive. That said, leaders accepted that not every risk could be controlled. Intelligence reduces uncertainty, but it doesn't erase it. The useful takeaway for today is practical: gather facts early, use discreet channels when public moves would backfire, and keep some options hidden until the right moment. A little humor helps too. Treat foreign intrigues like a difficult family holiday, plan the seating, monitor the gossip, and have an escape route. The Spanish Armada, a case study in systems failure. Spain's plan depended on a link-up. A large invasion fleet was to meet and escort troops from the Netherlands across the Channel, and everything hinged on timing, ships, and secure lines of communication. That dependence created an obvious single point of failure. When the fleet and the land forces could not coordinate, the whole operation became fragile, like a relay race where one runner misses the handoff. Poor information flow made small problems grow. Orders took a long time to reach different squadrons, signals were misunderstood, and commanders on both sides had different expectations. English captains used fireships to scatter the tight Spanish formation, then exploited their smaller, faster ships to harass and fire at range. Spain's ships were built for close fighting and boarding. English gunnery favored long, aimed volleys that punished the Spaniards without getting close. Those tactical mismatches exposed a larger systems issue. When parts of a plan are optimized for different kinds of action, they don't mesh well under stress. Logistics and contingency planning were weak where it mattered most. Supplies and resupply routes were vulnerable, and there weren't simple fallbacks when weather or enemy action interfered. Weather itself became a system actor. Storms drove many vessels off course and onto dangerous coasts, destroying ships that were still seaworthy. Think of it like organizing a big outdoor concert and not having a rain plan. A sudden storm doesn't just dampen spirits, it cancels the gig unless backups exist. Leadership and trust also played a role. Command structures were layered and rigid, and when the situation changed rapidly, those layers slowed decisions. Local captains sometimes had to improvise, but without clear delegated authority they hesitated. It's much like a group project where every decision needs the boss's signature. Progress halts when the boss can't be reached. Simple redundancies, clear contingency chains, decentralized authority, and common procedures were missing. The broader lesson is about interactions rather than single causes. When communication, timing, equipment design, logistics, and environment all interact poorly, failures cascade. Modern planners can learn a lot from this: test assumptions early, practice coordination between teams, build simple backups, and plan for the worst weather as if it will happen. A little common sense and a spare key can save a lot of headaches, or, to put it another way, check the cake in the oven before you invite everyone over. Art, symbolism, and national identity. Portraits of the Queen were never just attempts to capture a face, they were carefully arranged messages meant to be read like a billboard. Painters placed crowns, jewels, books, globes, animals, and flowers in ways that told simple stories. A pearl might stand for chastity, a globe suggested reach across the seas, and a pelican brooch hinted at self-sacrifice and maternal care. You can see this most clearly in famous pictures where she is surrounded by symbols, the globe under her hand, a tiny ship in the background, or a curtain pulled back to reveal a naval scene, each item chosen so a viewer would instantly understand what the monarch wanted to say without asking a single question. Think of it like modern branding: a corporate logo, a politician's flag pin, or the carefully staged selfie that sends a clear message about who someone wants to be seen as. Poets and playwrights acted like the period's PR team, using stories and allegories to build a shared national image. Writers compared the ruler to mythic figures and virtues, turning private politics into public theater. One poem might present her as a wise queen, another as a protective mother of the nation. Public entertainments, masks, and pageants worked the same way. Costumes and characters stood for ideas such as order, prosperity, and divine favor. In everyday life you see the same technique when a city stages a parade: the music, the banners, and the floats all tell a story about who that place wants to be. A lot less lace, but the principle is identical. Objects used in visual culture carried short, powerful messages that could reach people who couldn't read. A portrait with a book signaled learning, one that included a sword or armor suggested strength and defense, a rose or Tudor emblem signaled lineage and legitimacy. Museums now point these things out to visitors, but you can practice at home. Spot the symbols, then ask what they're trying to say. A smile might be friendly, but an eagle clutching arrows is making a bolder statement. And yes, a ruff can be read like neck armor, protective, decorative, and loudly announcing status, so fashion was propaganda, too. That's subtle and hilarious when you picture it in daily life. Think of someone turning up at a meeting in a power suit and a ruff. The visual language created a shared story about nationhood that had legs well beyond the court. Naval triumphs, explored coasts, and maps showed up in tapestries and paintings, turning events into national myths that people celebrated in song and print. Over time those images became part of a bigger identity, symbols that later generations would reuse on coins, in public ceremonies, and in art, because they already carried emotional weight. If you visit galleries today you can follow the breadcrumbs: a repeated rose here, a recurrent globe there, eyes and ears embroidered on a gown to mean vigilance. To spot the message quickly, look for repeated motifs and consider what they would mean to someone who couldn't read a newspaper. It's storytelling in pictures, practical and pointed, and sometimes rather theatrical, almost like a centuries-old marketing campaign with better collars and worse lighting. The Queen's later years: aging, succession, and stability. In her final years the Queen's body began to show what time does to everyone: less energy, more careful steps, and the need to disguise changes in appearance. Portraits and eyewitness accounts tell us she lost teeth and relied heavily on cosmetics, wigs, and elaborate clothing to present the image of unchanging majesty. She had long used makeup to hide smallpox scars from earlier in life, and later those same theatrical tricks helped mask the lines and frailties that come with age. Everyday examples help. Think of a retired neighbor who dyes their hair, wears a favorite hat, and walks a bit slower to keep up appearances at family gatherings. Her refusal to marry left a crucial problem unresolved: who would follow her on the throne? That uncertainty was a constant political headache and forced those closest to her to act with both caution and secrecy. Rival courtiers competed for influence. The most famous quarrel was between the queen's old confidant and the young, confident favorite who led a doomed uprising, an event that exposed how fragile court politics could be. Behind the scenes, ministers like Robert Cecil quietly opened channels to James VI of Scotland to arrange a peaceful handover, much like a CEO arranging a successor through quiet talks rather than public drama. Keeping the country stable as the Queen aged required a mix of firm decisions and careful theatre. She balanced powerful nobles against one another, rewarded loyalty with pensions and titles, and used public ceremonies to project continuity. Parliament and law courts continued to function, and naval strength helped deter sudden foreign threats. These practical tools mattered as much as her personal authority. Picture a family business where the matriarch still signs checks but delegates daily tasks. The name stays the same on the door while trusted managers run the shop. In the end, her household's quiet maneuvering prevented the worst possibilities of a disputed succession. When she died, the transition to James VI of Scotland happened without the civil war that had befallen earlier dynasties, a rare peaceful change of rulers in a turbulent age. That outcome owed as much to patient bargaining and secrecy as to any single speech or battle. Humorous as it may sound, she treated the question of succession like a stage trick, never revealing the final cue until the curtain was ready to fall. Mythmaking versus evidence, separating legend from fact. Contemporary portraits, poems, and official papers were tools as much as records. They were shaped to make a message stick. The famous allegory in The Fairy Queen cast the monarch as a near-mythic figure, while large state portraits, like the elaborate Armada portrait and the pale, idealized court images, presented a controlled, flawless image meant to reassure and impress. Those items are real evidence, but they are not neutral. They tell us how courtiers wanted people to remember her, not always how things actually played out behind closed doors. Some legends are simple and catchy, which is why they survive. The idea that a single leader stood like a rock and single-handedly saved the nation is a tidy story. In reality, governance was messy. Ministers and counselors were constantly bargaining, money was tight at times, and policy often involved compromise. For instance, important decisions were debated with advisors whose letters and state papers survive. Those documents show negotiation and disagreement, not the solitary genius of a monarch acting alone. That contrast, big, dramatic myth versus patchwork evidence, is where historians spend most of their time. Propaganda and ceremony did heavy lifting. Pageants, expensive clothes, and public speeches worked like a branded campaign. Wearing pearls, symbolic jewelry, or appearing with certain emblems was deliberate messaging. Wardrobe accounts and household bills show the scale of that investment, and ambassadorial dispatches record how foreign courts received the performance. Think of it as an early PR operation. Pageantry equals polished headlines, while the ledgers and private letters are the behind-the-scenes receipts. A modern parallel is a carefully staged campaign photo versus the unpaid intern who actually set it up. Not every dramatic claim collapses under scrutiny, though. The story of a great naval victory is true in broad strokes, but eyewitness accounts, logistical records, and chroniclers reveal it as a team effort with luck and weather playing large parts. Similarly, harsh acts attributed solely to the monarch, such as the execution of rivals, sit alongside years of legal processes, intercepted correspondence, and council debates that complicate the easy moral verdicts. Documents from trials and council proceedings are dry, but they do pull back the curtain on motive and method. Historians separate legend from fact by cross-checking sources, asking who wrote a document and why, and comparing domestic records with foreign reports and material evidence. A single flattering poem or portrait will not carry the same weight if every ambassador's note and every account book tells a different story. In everyday life we do the same. We don't rely on one selfie to know the whole person. We look at other photos, talk to mutual friends, check receipts. A bit less mysterious, and a bit more accurate. Keeping both sides in view matters. Myth-making helped hold a nation together and created a symbol people could rally around. Evidence shows the real struggles, compromises, and calculated uses of image. Appreciating the theatricality and reading the paperwork gives a fuller picture, equal parts showmanship and administration, so the Queen becomes neither cartoon nor cold record, but a human leader operating in a complicated world. Long-term impacts, from Elizabeth I to industrial Britain. During her reign there was a clear push toward seafaring, trade, and the creation of long-distance business ventures, and those choices left marks that echoed into the age of factories and steam. The Crown began to grant charters to organize trading companies, one of which would later become a giant player in global commerce, and that model, pooling money from many investors to fund big, risky trips, became a prototype for larger-scale industry financing. Ports swelled with ships, sailors learned better navigation, and the practical know-how of building and outfitting sturdy merchant vessels advanced. In plain terms, Britain learned to move things reliably by sea, which is not so different from how modern supply chains learn to move boxes by truck and container ship. The legal and financial setup also matured in ways that made large projects possible. Royal charters and patents created precedents for protecting business ventures and inventions, even if the system was sometimes messy and abused. Merchants in the city developed ways of lending, crediting, and insuring cargo that were the ancestors of modern banks and investment mechanisms. Think of it like neighbors who pool cash to buy a delivery van for a small business. The van is the factory's capital, and the pooling is the very same idea that later funded mill machines and railways. Economic shifts at the time nudged people toward new kinds of work and living arrangements, setting up a labor force that would be needed later. Landowners reorganized farms to make them more productive, and when common fields were fenced and farms consolidated, many smallholders and rural workers headed for towns. That movement created a growing urban population accustomed to wage work rather than subsistence farming. At the same time, spinning, weaving, and other crafts were increasingly tied into wider markets, so skills and habits of producing for sale, rather than just for the household, spread. Picture someone trading their loom's output for cash in a town market. That habit of producing for pay rather than survival helped form the workforce that factories later relied on. Cultural and intellectual changes mattered too, and not only for poets and playwrights. The explosion in printing, the rise in everyday literacy, and a growing curiosity about navigation, mechanics, and natural observation encouraged practical learning. Apprenticeships, workshops, and experimental tinkering were common, and these small-scale experiments built a base of skilled people comfortable with tools and measurements. The state itself became better at keeping records, collecting taxes, and managing large projects, a rudimentary bureaucracy that could support national infrastructure and military needs when larger investments were required. In effect, the machinery of governance learned some basics that later made financing railways, canals, and factories administratively feasible. Taken together, the period set in motion a handful of practical things that mattered centuries later: stronger maritime commerce and global links that supplied raw materials and markets, financial and legal practices that allowed capital to be pooled and protected, social shifts that created cities full of wage earners, and a culture that valued technical knowledge and record-keeping. None of these levers caused industrialization on their own, but they formed a foundation, like putting good bricks and scaffolding in place before building a factory. And if you like a small historical chuckle, what started as royal favors and adventurous sea voyages eventually helped pay for smokestacks and steam engines. Turns out, empire building and textile manufacturing are awkward bedfellows, but they did leave Britain with the tools and networks needed for the industrial age. Why Golden Age? Evaluating the label. England's cultural scene truly blossomed during Elizabeth's reign, and that's the first reason people call it a golden age. Theatre, poetry, and music expanded in ways that reached ordinary townsfolk as well as courtiers. Playhouses drew crowds the way cinemas or streaming platforms do today. A busy afternoon in London might include a new play, songs in alehouses, and street performers. Famous writers then, Shakespeare and Marlowe, for example, wrote works that spoke to a wide range of people, not only the elite, and their plays still shape how we tell stories. At the same time, book production and reading rose, which is a practical sign of cultural vitality rather than an empty label. Maritime ambition and commercial growth added to the sparkle. English sailors and merchants pushed into new trade routes and came back with exotic goods that excited people from shopkeepers to nobles. Privateering and voyages of exploration brought fame and loot, and tales of sea adventures captured the public imagination much like blockbuster films do now. These successes funded art and court life, so culture and commerce fed each other. Yet the boom mostly concentrated in port towns and cities. Inland villages often saw very little change, which complicates the idea of a uniformly golden country. Not everything, however, was golden for everyone. Many people lived in poverty, struggled with poor harvests, faced outbreaks of disease, or were punished harshly for petty crimes. Laws against vagrancy and the rough life for agricultural laborers show a harsher side. While the monarch could be a powerful symbol of stability, portraits and court spectacle worked like carefully curated branding, ordinary life could be tough. A simple example, while courtiers wore elaborate ruffs and silk, a rural family might mend the same shirt for years. The contrast is stark and reminds us that a shiny headline doesn't tell the whole story. Propaganda and image-making played a big role in creating the Golden Age story. Portraits, poems, and court pageants presented the queen as a wise and almost mythical ruler, an early form of PR. These images helped build national pride and were repeated in later histories, which means some of the gold is polished publicity. Historians point out that the label often reflects later needs, people wanting an emblematic past to look back on during times of doubt. In short, the Golden Age is partly earned and partly constructed. When weighing the label, balance matters. The era produced cultural achievements of lasting value and gains in trade and naval power that transformed England's place in the world, and those are real reasons to praise the period. On the flip side, social inequality, religious conflict, and regional differences mean the gold covered only parts of society. Think of it like a beautiful city skyline seen from a distance, impressive, yes, but up close there are narrow alleys and imperfect roofs. That mixed picture is the most honest way to evaluate the Golden Age tag. So, to wrap up, Elizabeth I's reign brought relative peace and steady rule, a practical religious settlement that tried to keep people from fighting. Think of it like roommates agreeing on a cleaning rota so everyone can sleep better. Her navy's victory over the Spanish Armada was England's big team win, boosting national confidence. The arts and theatre bloomed. Shakespeare and Company turned London into a cultural hotspot, like a small town suddenly full of cafes and live music. Exploration and trade grew too, opening new markets much like a local shop expanding online. Together, these things helped create what we call a Golden Age: more money, more ideas, and more daring ambitions. If any of this surprised you or made you smile, tell me which moment stood out in the comments. Did the Armada feel like a sports upset, or did Shakespeare's rise feel more like your favorite band getting famous? If you enjoyed this calm, clear stroll through Tudor England, please like and subscribe. Think of it as bookmarking a good history book. Next time we'll follow what came after Elizabeth, the Stuart era under James I, and how that shift changed everyday life in Britain, with a closer look at Shakespeare's London. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next Slow History episode.